Today we are remembering the life of our father, Harry Dale Barger. Dad was an extraordinary man living a very ordinary life. You may have known him as a friend, a customer, a co-worker, or, more than likely, a teacher. We want to share with you some of the ways Mr. Barger became who he was, why he cared like he did, and what life was like with him after school was out. The third of 4 kids, Dad grew up in poverty in southern Indiana. His father, Bill, was a Stony who worked in the Bloomington quarries. His mother, Vernetta, cared for the kids in the home most of his childhood until she began working as a housekeeper at Indiana University. Dad often recalled how Granny made food from scratch, when they had food that is, and washed all of the clothes by hand. Granddad moved the family around whenever he could find more affordable housing. Dad said that Granddad would have moved them into an empty chicken coop if he could have found one cheap enough. So Dad grew up learning to make do with what he had and to be thankful for it. One winter, Granny even took a picture off the wall and traced Dad's feet on the cardboard backing. Then she cut them out and lined his worn-out, leaky shoes with the pieces. He also learned how to make a lot of friends. The Barger kids often had to change schools when their home was moved. He learned to fit in and find ways to be happy wherever he landed. His younger sister Betty was more shy than Dad, so he would even initiate friendships for her with other girls during recess. If you knew him as a teacher, you probably remember him being kind and welcoming to new students and helping them feel secure and accepted. He knew how they felt. He talked of being bullied and treated poorly because of their obvious poverty. His clothes were always well worn by the time they were handed down from his 2 older brothers, Jimmy and Billy. He didn't always have nice teachers when he was young. He couldn't understand why some of them chose to teach school when they seemed to hate kids. Dad always credited his teaching career to his mom. He complained about the way teachers treated him and some of the other kids, so Granny challenged him with, "What are you going to do about it?" She acknowledged that he couldn't change how his teachers thought and acted, but he could make school better for a lot of kids by becoming a teacher himself. Mr. Barger worked his way through college in the campus bookstore at Indiana University. He worked full-time and took heavy class loads. His mom would help him study sometimes at night. He told us that he was so exhausted at times he would ask his mom to dump ice water on his face if he did not wake up with his alarm. Despite all the hardships, he graduated with his bachelor's in education and a minor in child psychology in 3 years. Then he went right to work in Fort Wayne. Dad received his master's in education in the 1960s. It wasn't as commonplace at that time for classroom teachers to have advanced degrees. Then, in the 1980s, Dad was working on a PhD when we 2 girls came to live with him. As a single parent, he prioritized our care over his dreams and withdrew from the program. The hundreds or possibly thousands of kids Dad taught over his 42-year career were his kids. He didn't have to like them, although most of the time he truly did, but he cared about every one of them. Dad was the king of starting with a clean slate. One example was the story of a student who was being reprimanded by him. The student yelled at Dad that he was a stupid old bastard. Dad put on his meanest face and replied, "Don't you ever call me old." He could turn just about any kid around. More than once, he asked to have all the so-called trouble kids placed in his classroom for the upcoming school year. He didn't like them being labeled like that. He understood that some kids were coming from really hard home lives, and some days it was all they could do to breathe. This was before public schools had a lot of social support for students. Sometimes he was it. Speaking of support, don't expect any from a teacher parent when you're sick. You go to school as long as you have a heartbeat. And so did he. In fact, when he had a massive heart attack in 1994 that left him with 5 bypasses, he had 3 full months of paid time off to use for recovery because he never ever missed school. He was a teaching machine. The man even taught through a tornado. His classroom in Palmer, Texas opened to a hallway through one door, but straight outside through the other. His students started to take cover, and he stopped them. He said, "No, no, no. We're still having science. Take your seats. There's not going to be any tornado." Dad just kept right on teaching as the wind roared louder and the sky darkened. When class was over, the noise was too, so he opened the door to check it out. There was damage just across the narrow dirt road from his classroom door where it must have touched down. Teaching didn't end at 3:30. Growing up with Mr. Barger, we could hardly eat a meal without learning about its nutrients or play outside without learning about the mineral composition of the stones or any other given thing about the ecosystem in our current location. Everything was an opportunity to learn. Dad was diligent about work, but he also made time for fun. When we were little, he'd let us help with projects, which I know now as a parent just created more work for him. He'd ride us around in the wheelbarrow as he cleaned up the yard, and he'd dump us out on a pile of leaves and grass. He'd let us paint the garage door with a roller, and I'm sure he had to paint over it after we got bored and found other things to do. We'd climb on his back and supervise as he cut carpet or laid tile, on his hands and knees. Occasionally, he'd let us climb the attic ladder to satisfy our curiosity when he was working up there. Sometimes we got important jobs like holding one end of the tape measure or handing him a screwdriver. He always made us feel important. He loved to tease. Dad teased everyone. If he called you a nickname like Stinky, consider yourself loved. Mr. Barger loved setting his students and coworkers up with a good joke, too, or seeing how far he could get with a story before someone called his bluff. He could reel you in with a tale that seemed reasonably true in the beginning. That made it hard sometimes to know when to believe him, and that was the fun of it. Other times, he'd go straight to the unbelievable and swear it was true. He liked telling his students that he used to be a stunt double for Arnold Schwarzenegger or for Harrison Ford in the Indiana Jones movies. As he grew more gray, he added Sean Connery to the list and did his best James Bond impression as proof. Dad used an old slide carousel and projector for his presentations in class, and he would slip in photos of his biological children when teaching about wild animals. Then he'd lecture on our species and habitat and move right along like nothing different just happened. One of his favorite setups was a collection of letters from Mom. He wrote 22 ridiculous fictional accounts of the news from his hometown of Bloomington, supposedly written by his own mother. He pretended they were real and read them aloud to his classes from time to time, and even though they were filled with puns that brought lots of eye rolls and groans, the kids loved them. He dished it out a lot, but he could also take it. His students felt comfortable to have fun with him. It was easy for him to let out a big, hearty laugh at himself when anyone got the best of him. He had the best laugh. Letters from Mom weren't the only writings he did. Harry Barger was active in the Indiana Council for Social Studies and became the only elementary school teacher on the board. He wrote several articles for them and gave presentations to colleagues during annual conventions at various colleges and universities across the state on how to make teaching Indiana history more interesting. Dad was also involved in the Fort Wayne Allen County Historical Society and the Indiana Association of Historians. He co-authored a high school history textbook, and he wrote Teaching Indiana History, a handbook. It was popular enough to need a second printing. Later in life, he wrote a column for the Athens Daily Review called Chalk Dust and Hall Passes that were excerpts from a manuscript he was working on. And he published a book called Classroom Comedies, The Lighter Side of Teaching. He always kept busy. My sister Nikki and I were each in his class as sixth graders. He was a little harder on us, so there would be no accusations of favoritism. He made us call him Mr. Barger, too. Inevitably, we both slipped up and called him Dad early on. What do you think happened next? Lots of other kids started calling him Dad, too. He really didn't mind, since his classroom culture was always a tight-knit family. As we grew to teens, many of our friends addressed him as Dad, too. They were comfortable to walk in our door without knocking and walk through the house to find us, waving at Dad on the way by. He loved that. They were all his kids. We never minded sharing our dad with his students or our friends, or half the community, as it were. More love for others never meant less love for us. His heart was big enough. Dad was compelled to do good deeds. I don't think he ever set out with the intention for today to be a helping day, but he just stumbled into opportunities. Or maybe the opportunities sought him out on some higher level because it was part of his calling. Or maybe we are all sought out and we don't always notice or take hold of our opportunities to be helpers. Whatever the reason, Dad just couldn't help it. There was a period of time that Dad noticed a man walking down Prairieville Street in the early hours every morning as he was driving to school. He'd wave. It was raining one morning, so Dad gave him a lift. Well, he just couldn't drive past him after that, so he gave him a lift whenever he saw him. Then winter came, and the man was walking with no coat. Dad took a coat, gloves, and hat from his own closet to give to the stranger. His kindness was directed to all people, not just his kids. He spent a few months one year going to a nursing home on Saturdays to visit with the residents. He didn't know any of them, but he'd say, "Those old people just get thrown away up there. I try to break up their day." When Christmas came, he ordered enough cookies from the Winn-Dixie Bakery for every resident to have 2 cookies. Then he realized there was another nursing home that he was neglecting, and they'd probably like to have cookies too. Then he realized there was a third, and he couldn't leave them out. He was telling me how expensive it had gotten and how he wouldn't be able to do it again the following year. I reminded him that he didn't have to go through with it because none of the residents or staff knew anything about it. "But I know," he said. He always worked for extra money to splurge with, or sometimes he would stash it away to help his kids on a rainy day. When we lived in Indiana, Dad would lay new tile flooring in the schools during summer break. In Texas, he worked selling tickets or running the scoreboard at almost every sport. Splurging with the teacher's salary meant Friday night pizza or a Saturday afternoon matinee with 1 popcorn for us to share. Once, after taking us to KFC for lunch, he snuck a chicken leg into the movie in the pocket of his jean jacket. When he started eating it in the dark, the smell filled the theater. We started hearing a few people say things like, "Is that chicken?" Or, "I tried. The concession stand says they don't sell fried chicken." Growing up with Dad, Saturdays and summertime were for bike rides and board games. Mr. Barger really was a kid at heart. He found as much joy in play as his children did. He allowed for gaggles of girls at sleepovers and liked making us all waffles in the morning. He loved corny old TV shows, period films, and musicals. History was a passion for him, and he knew all sorts of trivia. Consequently, we usually got a history lesson during these shows. Dad played with his school kids, too. In his manuscript for Chalk Dust and Hall Passes, he wrote about how much more attentive his elementary students were in class if he played with them at recess. Races, hopscotch, jump rope, he did it all. Dad settled in Athens in 1988. He loved it there. Mr. Barger became pretty anchored in the community. Running into former students and their families was always meaningful to him. He thrived on keeping up with what his kids were doing long after they left his classroom. In his later years, Dad enjoyed retirement with his wife, Brenda. They had a fun routine of game nights, friends and family visits, home improvement projects, and a weekly restaurant circuit that was maybe as much about passing out hugs as it was about eating meals. Dad received many reminders of his mortality with at least 3 serious car accidents, a stroke, 2 heart attacks, and 5 bypasses. They just made him all the more grateful for each day and all the more determined to do good deeds for others. We miss him. We will miss him every moment for the rest of our days. The ripple effect of his words, deeds, and hugs will continue through those who remain. He taught us to always look for the good in others, to forgive and allow fresh starts, to compliment more readily than criticize, to choose laughter instead of tears, and to always do more than what was expected. Dad chose to have his remains donated to medical education and research. Why? So he could continue to teach. We'd like to ask you for a couple favors. First, Please share any stories, jokes, photos, lessons from, or memories of Dad in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Although I wouldn't think we could possibly love him any more than we do, somehow that's exactly what happens when we see how he was cared about through other people's eyes. Second, do a good deed. Whether you take a one-time opportunity or create a new habit, please think of him when you do it.